Welcome to part 2 of the menstrual cycle series. In this video, we're going to take a closer look at ovulation. And though it's not required, it's highly encouraged that you watch part 1, the basics video, where we covered just each phase of the menstrual cycle series, so that if I covered anything in there that I'm sort of assuming you have when you watch this video, you're not missing any information. And so if we go back to that basics video, you'll remember that ovulation is right in the middle of the entire cycle, coming after the follicular phase and right before the luteal phase. Ovulation is when the egg is released from the ovary and travels down the fallopian tube into the uterus. But let's take a closer look at ovulation, because the process of ovulation actually starts about 100 days prior. Now, what we have here is an internal image of what the ovaries look like with throughout the menstrual cycle process. And we have primary follicles, and primary follicles are what the follicles look like prior to puberty. And then at puberty, with sort of that injection of estrogen, we have the secondary follicles. And the secondary follicles are, when we talk about the follicles growing, we're talking about these secondary follicles. And the follicles grow, but they do it in sort of a stop, start process that begins about 100 days prior to ovulation. And this is important because the follicles inside the ovaries are really delicate and can be impacted by a lot of things, and particularly impacted, over 3 months prior to the ovulation or even the menstrual cycle that will release this egg eventually. Things that can impact that follicular growth can be inflammation, deficiency of things like magnesium, iodine, zinc, vitamins B and D, and even thyroid issues. So there's a risk that the follicles may not be able to produce an egg. And even if the follicle does produce an egg, that high stress can mean that ovulation is either delayed or outright canceled by the body. This is a protective mechanism because a body under stress does not have the additional resources to devote to a pregnancy. And so this whole process could be aborted at any point by the body because they're like, nah, we're good. We shouldn't have a pregnancy going on right now. There's too much externally happening. So going back to that 100 days and the start-stop process. And then we sort of zoom back up to day one or two of the cycle. At the beginning of each cycle, there's actually about 20 secondary follicles that begin to grow an egg. And what happens around day 1 or 2 is the hippocampus sends a message to the pituitary gland, both located within our brains, to begin to release the follicle growth hormone, or FGH. The follicle growth hormone begins that message for these secondary follicles, around, like I said, 20 of them, to begin growing. As this process is happening, the follicles are also releasing estrogen. All these chemicals and hormones we'll talk about in another video, but I just want to give you kind of a taste of where these hormones are coming from. So in this case, that estrogen is being released as these follicles are growing an egg. And just before ovulation, FGH and another hormone called luteal hormone, often shorted to LH, have a spike right before ovulation. And that spike usually goes to the follicle that has the most potential and the best, egg. And that's the vesicular follicle that, in this image that we see here, that image. And then at ovulation, the follicle literally bursts, hurtling the egg to the fallopian tubes. This process is a highly inflammatory process, this bursting process. And some people can feel the bursting sensation or pain when this happens. And then at the top image here, we see that kind of a bigger picture of the ovaries and the uterus and the fallopian tubes. Right after the egg bursts from the ovary, it's sort of thrown into the abdominal cavity, and the little finger projections of the fallopian tube collect the egg, and it begins its journey down to the uterus. Now, the empty follicle immediately begins to reorganize itself and becomes what we call the corpus luteum. When we have this corpus luteum, it begins to produce large quantities of progesterone and some estrogen. And this is why the biggest range within a cycle is typically during this follicle and follicular phase, like I mentioned in video 1, where the most deviation is in this follicular phase. However, because of that start-stop process and the fact that ovulation may be delayed. And then if you remember, I said the luteal phase is one of the more predictable phases, and that's because the luteal phase represents this corpus luteum. So luteal comes from luteum. And in this luteal phase, so we have that from ovulation right up until day 1 of the next cycle, is about 13 to 14 days, because the corpus luteum only does its thing for 13 to 14 days before it eventually becomes, regresses and becomes part of the body again. So I hope you have a good idea now of kind of what ovulation looks like, and we have a little taste of the hormones that we'll cover in the next video as we talk about not only the hormones and what they do to our bodies, to our minds, and to our moods, but how this process can actually change the very makeup and the very structure of our brains. So head on to part 3 of the menstrual cycle series.